Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel NPA Discovery, the place where we look beyond the familiar songs, famous photographs, and carefully preserved legends to discover the complicated human stories behind the world's most influential artists. Today, we are exploring the rise, collapse, and extraordinary legacy of the Beatles. They were four young musicians from Liverpool who changed popular culture with a speed and force that the entertainment industry had never witnessed before. They transformed songwriting, recording, fashion, youth culture, celebrity, and the very idea of what a musical group could accomplish. But behind the harmonies was rivalry. Behind the jokes was exhaustion. Behind the friendship was resentment. And behind some of the most joyful music ever recorded were four individuals struggling with grief, insecurity, addiction, creative ambition, and the suffocating pressure of becoming more important to the world than they had ever expected. The title of this video suggests that the Beatles' glorious success was inseparable from conflict and tragedy. I agree with that idea, but I reject the simplistic version of it. The Beatles did not collapse because of one woman. They did not break up because of a single argument. They were not destroyed in one dramatic moment. Their ending emerged gradually from a combination of forces: the death of their manager, creative competition, financial confusion, personal relationships, emotional exhaustion, changing priorities, and four men attempting to discover who they were outside the identity they had built together. The Beatles' story is not merely about fame. It is about friendship under pressure. It is about what happens when shared ambition creates success beyond anyone's imagination, and then that same success begins to separate the people who created it. It is also about the consequences of leaving important feelings unspoken. When John Lennon was murdered in 1980, Paul McCartney gave reporters a brief response that sounded cold to many listeners. But the remark was not proof that Paul did not care. It was an example of what emotional shock can do to language. A man who had spent years communicating through music suddenly found himself unable to explain the death of the person with whom he had created some of the most important songs of the 20th century. That moment will become significant later in our story. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video, share it with another Beatles fan, and subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to continue creating thoughtful documentaries about the artists, relationships, and cultural moments that shaped generations. Now, let us return to Liverpool before the stadiums, before the screaming fans, and before the world knew the names John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Let us discover how four imperfect young men became the Beatles. In 1956, 16-year-old John Lennon formed a skiffle group connected to Quarrymen High School. The band became known as the Quarrymen. Skiffle was accessible, energetic, and perfectly suited to post-war British teenagers who wanted to make music without expensive equipment or formal training. A guitar, a washboard, a makeshift bass, and enough confidence could create the beginning of a band. John possessed confidence in abundance. He was intelligent, funny, defensive, rebellious, and emotionally wounded. His mother, Julia, played an important role in encouraging his love of music, but his childhood had been shaped by separation and instability. He was largely raised by his Aunt Mimi, while his relationship with his parents remained complicated. Music gave John a place to turn confusion into energy. He could command attention before he had learned how to manage emotion. On July 6, 1957, the Quarrymen performed at a church event in Woolton. A mutual friend introduced John to 15-year-old Paul McCartney. Paul watched the band and then demonstrated his own musical ability. He could tune a guitar correctly. He knew the words and chords to popular songs. He possessed a level of discipline that immediately distinguished him. John faced an important decision. Paul was talented enough to improve the group. He was also talented enough to challenge John's authority. John later acknowledged the tension inside that choice. Bringing Paul into the band meant strengthening the music while accepting that he would no longer be the only exceptional personality in the room. That decision became the foundation of the Beatles. The partnership between Lennon and McCartney would eventually produce one of the most celebrated songwriting catalogs in popular music. But from the beginning, admiration and competition existed together. John was instinctive, provocative, and emotionally direct. Paul was structured, melodic, and technically ambitious. John could provide danger. Paul could provide design. Each recognized something valuable in the other. This is an important lesson about creative partnerships. The best collaborator is not always the person who agrees with us. Sometimes the most valuable partner is the person whose strengths expose our weaknesses. John encouraged Paul to become bolder. Paul encouraged John to become more precise. Their competition pushed both men forward. But the same competition that improved their work would later become emotionally exhausting. Paul eventually introduced his younger friend George Harrison. George was only 14 when Paul began recommending him. John initially saw him as too young. But George's guitar ability was difficult to ignore. A famous story describes George demonstrating his skill on the upper level of a Liverpool bus. He played a complicated instrumental passage, showing John that he possessed the technique the group needed. George joined. At first, he was the younger member following the older boys. Over time, that hierarchy would become a source of frustration. The Beatles were not yet complete, and they were certainly not famous. They were young men learning chords, changing names, losing members, playing whenever someone offered them a stage, and attempting to imagine a life larger than the one Liverpool appeared to offer. Success was not guaranteed. Most young bands disappear. They rehearse in bedrooms, play local events, argue over equipment, and eventually separate when work, marriage, or disappointment becomes more practical than music. The Beatles survived those early years because the central members were ambitious enough to continue and competitive enough to refuse mediocrity. They were not simply dreaming. They were developing. That difference matters. A dream becomes a career only when imagination is joined by repeated work. Soon, that work would take them to Hamburg, Germany, a city that would exhaust them, educate them, and transform them from an enthusiastic local group into a powerful live band. The Beatles' touring years were not merely tiring. They became dangerous. The band faced political controversy, religious outrage, inadequate security, technical limitations, and the possibility that a crowd could become uncontrollable. John Lennon's comment that the Beatles had become more popular than Christianity caused enormous anger in parts of the United States after it was republished without the full context. Records were burned. Threats were made. The band entered environments where the possibility of violence felt real. The controversy revealed the power and danger of celebrity language. A complicated observation could be reduced to a provocative headline and carried into homes, churches, and political discussions. John eventually attempted to explain and apologize, but the emotional damage had already occurred. The Beatles were learning that fame did not only enlarge admiration. It enlarged mistakes. A private person can make a poorly phrased comment that affects a few listeners. A famous person can make one sentence and create an international crisis. Touring technology also failed to match the size of the venues. At stadium shows, the group performed through sound systems inadequate for the crowds. Fans screamed. The musicians struggled to hear one another. Subtlety became impossible. Imagine spending years developing musical ability only to reach the largest stage in the world and discover that the performance can no longer be heard properly. The situation was artistically absurd. The Beatles began treating some concerts with less seriousness because precision seemed irrelevant. If no one could hear the details, the incentive to protect them disappeared. They were also physically vulnerable. Security around celebrity culture had not yet developed to modern standards. The group was moved through crowds, vehicles, backstage areas, and hotels under conditions that could become chaotic. By the end of the 1966 tour, the Beatles decided to stop performing live. Their final scheduled concert took place at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. The decision shocked an industry built around touring, but it liberated the band creatively. Without the requirement to reproduce songs on stage, they could use the recording studio as an instrument. They could add sounds that four musicians could not perform simultaneously. They could use tape manipulation, orchestral arrangements, unusual instruments, altered speeds, and layered vocals. This transition changed popular music. Before, a record had often been treated as documentation of a performance. The Beatles increasingly treated a record as a separate artistic world. A painter does not need to recreate a canvas live for the painting to be legitimate. The Beatles began approaching recordings with similar freedom. Ending tours did not reduce their ambition. It redirected it. The studio became a laboratory. George Martin and engineer Geoff Emerick helped translate ideas into sound. John, Paul, George, and Ringo experimented with structures that would have been impossible to reproduce accurately in the stadiums they had left behind. The results included Revolver and later Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Beatles escaped one form of pressure, but the freedom of the studio intensified another. They now had more time to examine each other's ideas. Creative differences that could once be ignored during constant travel became increasingly visible. The band was becoming more artistically sophisticated while its internal relationships were becoming more complicated. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band became a symbol of the Beatles' studio transformation. The album took months rather than hours to create. This difference illustrates how dramatically their process had evolved. During the recording of their first album, the goal had largely been to capture the energy of the live group efficiently. By 1967, the studio had become a space where imagination could be reconstructed piece by piece. The Beatles experimented with orchestration, tape effects, sound collage, character, and theatrical presentation. The fictional identity of Sgt. Pepper's Band gave them psychological freedom. They could step away from the public expectations attached to the Beatles and pretend to be another group. This is a creative strategy many artists use. A new character, costume, format, or name can reduce fear because the artist feels temporarily released from previous success. The question changes from, what must the Beatles do next, to, what might this imaginary band attempt? The album's influence extended beyond individual songs. It encouraged listeners to experience a popular record as a complete artistic object. The cover mattered. The sequence mattered. The transitions mattered. The idea of the album mattered. Its success demonstrated that experimentation did not have to remain commercially marginal. Millions of listeners were willing to follow artists into unfamiliar territory. But 1967 also brought a devastating change. Brian Epstein died in August from an accidental overdose. He was only 32. The Beatles lost more than a manager. They lost a stabilizing figure who had handled business, mediated disagreements, organized professional life, and protected the group's collective structure. A successful team may appear self-sufficient because its visible members receive the attention. Behind that team often stands someone performing essential emotional and administrative labor. When that person disappears, the entire system can become unstable. Brian had weaknesses and made mistakes, but he gave the Beatles a center. After his death, questions multiplied. Who would make business decisions? Who could tell the Beatles no? Who would manage conflicts among four increasingly independent men? Who could protect their shared interests when individual priorities began diverging? The Beatles attempted to continue, but the absence of clear leadership created confusion. Paul responded by becoming more active. He proposed projects, organized sessions, and pushed the others to keep working. From Paul's perspective, the band required momentum. Without a project, they might drift apart. From the perspective of the others, Paul could appear controlling. This difference became crucial. A behavior intended as rescue can be experienced as domination. Paul may have believed he was protecting the Beatles. George and Ringo sometimes felt they were being directed. John increasingly pursued interests that existed outside the band. None of them were entirely wrong. After Brian's death, the Beatles searched for spiritual direction. They became interested in Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and transcendental meditation. The search took them to India. The journey would produce creative abundance, but it would not permanently restore unity. The Beatles began as teenagers playing music because music offered excitement, identity, and escape. They became professionals through difficult nights in Hamburg. They became stars through talent, management, discipline, timing, and relentless work. They became artists by refusing to repeat the formula that had already made them successful. And they became legends partly because their story ended before the world was ready. But legends can hide human beings. John Lennon was not merely the rebellious genius or the symbol of peace. He was a wounded, brilliant, contradictory man capable of tenderness and cruelty. Paul McCartney was not merely the charming perfectionist or controlling bandleader. He was a gifted composer attempting to protect the group that had defined his life, sometimes without recognizing how his methods affected others. George Harrison was not merely the quiet Beatle. He was an evolving songwriter and spiritual seeker who fought to be taken seriously within a hierarchy he had outgrown. Ringo Starr was not merely the lucky drummer. He was a distinctive musician and survivor whose rhythm, personality, and adaptability helped hold the group together. Brian Epstein was not simply the manager in the background. He gave shape and direction to talent the established industry had initially rejected. George Martin was not merely a producer pressing a record button. He helped the Beatles convert imagination into sound. Yoko Ono did not single-handedly destroy the group. She became part of John's transformation and a visible source of tension within relationships that were already changing. No single villain explains the ending. No single genius explains the success. The Beatles were created through connection. They were damaged through failures of connection. And they survive because the music continues creating connections among people who were not alive when the band existed. That may be their greatest achievement. They demonstrated that popular music could be immediate and sophisticated. A song could make someone dance while also encouraging reflection. A band could begin with simple instruments and eventually use the studio to construct worlds. For young men from Liverpool could influence language, fashion, technology, art, business, and social behavior across the planet. But their story also gives us a warning. Success does not protect relationships automatically. Talent does not eliminate insecurity. Money does not resolve grief. Public love does not replace private understanding. People who create beautifully together may still hurt one another deeply. The answer is not to avoid collaboration. The answer is to care for relationships with the same discipline used to care for the work. Listen before resentment becomes identity. Allow roles to change. Recognize the quiet contributor. Do not confuse leadership with permanent authority. Do not assume shared history removes the need for present respect. Say what matters while the other person can still hear it. This final lesson becomes especially powerful when we remember Paul's stunned response after John's murder. For years, John and Paul had communicated affection indirectly. Through competition. Through jokes. Through songs. Through criticism. Through memories. Then John was gone, and Paul stood before reporters unable to produce words large enough for the loss. There are emotions music can express more accurately than conversation. But life does not always give us time to place every feeling inside a song. Do not wait for tragedy to clarify what someone meant to you. Do not allow pride to become the final language of an important relationship. You may have a friend with whom you built part of your life. Perhaps you no longer speak. Perhaps the relationship cannot return to what it was. Reconciliation does not always mean reunion. It may mean releasing the need to win the final argument. It may mean acknowledging the value of a chapter that ended badly. It may mean offering an apology without demanding access to the person again. It may mean remembering honestly, without turning someone into either a saint or a villain. The Beatles could not remain together forever. Nothing does. Bands end. Companies change. Families lose members. Friendships transform. Bodies age. Voices disappear. But an ending does not erase what existed before it. The Beatles' breakup did not make their collaboration a failure. John's flaws did not erase the beauty of his best work. Paul's ambition did not erase his love for the band. George's resentment did not erase his loyalty during the years that mattered. Ringo's quieter role did not make his presence replaceable. Their imperfections are not interruptions in the story, but enough unity to create something larger than any of them. That is both heartbreaking and empowering. We do not need perfect circumstances to create meaningful work. We do not need to eliminate every disagreement before beginning. We do not need to remain connected forever for a relationship to change our lives. We need presence. We need courage. We need the willingness to offer an idea and allow another person to transform it. We need enough humility to recognize that individual talent can become more powerful through collaboration. And we need enough wisdom to understand when a chapter must change. The Beatles' music continues because it contains human contradictions. Joy and sadness. Confidence and uncertainty. Simplicity and experimentation. Youth and mortality. Love and separation. The songs do not deny darkness. They carry listeners through it. Perhaps that is why generations continue returning to them. The Beatles did not promise that love would prevent pain. Their story proved the opposite. Love makes loss possible. Friendship makes betrayal painful. Collaboration makes separation difficult. But the possibility of pain does not make connection a mistake. It makes connection valuable. John, Paul, George, and Ringo stepped into a shared rhythm before any of them understood where it would lead. They challenged one another. They wounded one another. They changed one another. And together, they changed us. The screaming eventually stopped. The concerts ended. The business disputes became history. John and George left the world. Paul and Ringo carried forward. But place a Beatles record on a turntable, press play on a digital track, or hear the opening chord of a familiar song, and time briefly collapses. Liverpool returns. The Cavern returns. Hamburg returns. The Ed Sullivan stage returns. Abbey Road returns. The rooftop returns. For young men stand together again, not as perfect legends, but as musicians listening, responding, competing, and creating. That is what remains. Not the arguments alone. Not the tragedy alone. Not the mythology alone. The music. The evidence that connection, however temporary, can outlive the people who created it. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rise, conflict, loss, and enduring legacy of the Beatles. Let us know in the comments which Beatles song means the most to you, and the memory, person, or moment you associate with it. Please like this video, share it with another music lover, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories from behind the legends. And until next time, remember, the most important thing we create may not be what we achieve alone. It may be what becomes possible when we truly listen to one another. The Beatles were never perfect. Their friendship was never simple. Their ending was never painless. But for one extraordinary moment in history, 4 separate lives found the same rhythm. And the world is still moving to it.